A millionaire helped a little girl who fell off her bike while he was running. When she saw him, she said something that made his face turn pale. The rhythmic clatter of keys against polished wood was the only sound in the vast, glass-walled office. Frank Marshall barely looked up as his secretary, Claire, placed a neatly stacked file on his desk. "You've got a call with the Tokyo division in 10 minutes, she said, glancing at her tablet. "And," she hesitated before adding, "the Boston City Annual Marathon is this Sunday. You registered months ago." Frank stopped typing. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a fraction too long. He had almost forgotten. The marathon had once been a highlight of his year, back when it meant something more than another checked box on his list of personal maintenance. He had made it a tradition, not for competition, but because there was something about losing himself in the pounding of feet on pavement, the unraveling spools of city streets, the brief illusion that he was running towards something instead of away from everything else. Frank exhaled, closing his laptop with a quiet click. "What time does it start?" 7 a.m., Claire answered. "I'll have your gear ready." He gave a small nod, dismissing her with a glance. She left, and the silence stretched thin again. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city pulsed with life below, cabs threading through clogged intersections, office lights flickering like a skyline heartbeat, people moving in organized chaos. Frank watched them for a long moment, expression unreadable. Then he pushed himself up, straightened his tie, and went back to his relentless schedule. The morning of the race arrived, crisp and cool. The house was silent, but not in the way that invited peace. It was a stillness so thick it pressed into the walls, into the gleaming marble floors, into every empty room that held nothing but the echo of footsteps. Frank sat on the edge of his king-sized bed, exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face before standing. Across the dimly lit room, the floor-to-ceiling windows stretched open to the city, a skyline of wealth, movement, and stories he was no longer part of. Boston was awake, alive, and yet, inside his own house, there was only the hollow quiet of routine. He dressed in measured movements, compression sleeves, high-performance running shoes, and a watch synced to the second. Outside, his driver stood waiting, but Frank waved him off. He would run to the starting line. The city's annual marathon was a spectacle, thousands of people, all chasing something. Some ran for a cause, some for competition, and some to outrun their own ghosts. Frank had no illusions. He wasn't here to win. He was here to forget. The announcer's voice blared over the speakers, but he barely registered it. Around him, runners stretched, chatted, and checked their laces. Some were serious athletes. Others were weekend warriors here for the thrill of participation. Frank, in his expensive but understated running gear, blended somewhere in between. A countdown began. The gunshot cracked through the air, and they surged forward as one. For the first few miles, Frank kept pace with the steady, rhythmic drum of footsteps all around him. The city's architecture blurred in his periphery, brick facades giving way to glass towers, coffee shops spilling early risers onto the sidewalks. But gradually, as he always did, he drifted inward. His mind detached from his body, letting muscle memory take over. The steady thud-thud-thud of his shoes against asphalt became something else. The ticking of time slipping through his fingers, the echo of conversations never had, the weight of names he no longer spoke aloud. He had built an empire. He had everything a man could want. Yet, somehow, it all felt hollow. Frank blinked, shaking off the thought. And then, just as he was rounding a bend onto a quieter street, something broke through the haze. A sharp cry, followed by the unmistakable scrape of metal against pavement. His head snapped to the side, just in time to see a small figure topple over onto the sidewalk, a bicycle clattering beside her. A child. He should have kept running. The race was still moving, the road stretching forward, urging him not to break pace. But before he could rationalize the choice, his body had already decided. He veered off course. The sound of his sneakers scuffing against the ground as he came to a halt was almost foreign to him. He wasn't used to stopping. The girl sat up, her hands pressing against her scraped knee, her braid half undone, strands of brown hair falling loose across her face. She didn't cry, just blinked up at him with wide, assessing eyes. Frank crouched down. "Are you okay?" She nodded, but didn't move. He reached out, hesitated, then offered his hand. "You took a hard fall." The girl tilted her head, studying him with a scrutiny that made him uncomfortable. Then she said it. "I know you. Your photo is in Dad's wallet." A pause. A single, impossible moment, where the street noise faded, where Frank felt something crack along the surface of his carefully constructed life. His brow furrowed. "What?" She brushed at her scraped knee absent-mindedly, as if her words weren't shattering the ground beneath him. "I've seen your picture, in Dad's wallet." Frank felt the subtle but unmistakable shift in his own breathing. He had spent years cultivating control, a mind that worked in logic, efficiency, and precision. Yet right now, nothing made sense. He could have laughed it off, could have brushed it aside with a simple, "You must be mistaken." But he didn't. Frank cleared his throat, carefully measured. "What's your name?" "Mary." A simple answer, a name that meant nothing to him, and yet it did. "Where's your dad?" She pointed down the street, unfazed. "Home." Frank hesitated. There was no reason for him to be standing here, lingering in a conversation that made no sense. He could pat her on the head, make sure she was okay, and move on. And yet, he didn't. Instead, against every bit of logic, every carefully built wall inside him, he found himself saying, "Take me to him." Mary grinned, wiping her dusty hands on her shorts before grabbing her bicycle. "Okay." Without waiting for him, she started walking. And Frank, for reasons he couldn't yet explain, followed. Frank Marshall wasn't a man accustomed to hesitation. His life was structured, calculated, every move measured against risk and reward. But now, as he trailed behind a 7-year-old girl through streets he hadn't walked in decades, he felt something he hadn't in a long time. Uncertainty. Mary moved ahead with effortless ease, weaving her bicycle through cracked sidewalks and uneven pavement, as if unaware of the profound shift she had caused in his morning. Frank, on the other hand, felt every step, the rhythm of his expensive running shoes muffled by the worn-out streets, a stark contrast to the meticulously paved roads he was used to. With every block, the scenery changed. The glass towers and luxury boutiques of the city's center receded into modest storefronts, aging brick apartments, and laundry lines swaying between fire escapes. The air smelled different here, a mix of fresh bread from a nearby bakery, motor oil, and the distant tang of damp pavement. Frank wasn't sure what he expected, but the sheer normalcy of it unsettled him. He wasn't stepping into a different world, just one he had ignored for far too long. Mary barely looked back. She hummed under her breath, occasionally waving at neighbors or dodging an uneven crack in the pavement. Frank noticed how people recognized her. Small nods from shopkeepers, a friendly call from a woman at a fruit stand. She belonged here. He didn't. Finally, Mary slowed as they approached a small apartment complex, its paint peeling at the edges, metal railings rusting where the weather had eaten through. A bicycle, smaller than hers, its chain broken, leaned haphazardly against the railing, as if someone had abandoned the idea of fixing it. She propped her own bike against the stairs and looked up at him. "This is it." Frank studied the building, his hands tightening at his sides. The door was old, its edges frayed with time. A small dent marred the handle, like someone had slammed it too hard, too often. He exhaled slowly, schooling his features into neutrality. Mary knocked, rapping her knuckles against the wood in a pattern that suggested familiarity. For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then, the sound of hesitant footsteps, a shuffle of movement inside. The door creaked open, and there he was. Fred. The man standing in the dim doorway looked like a faded reflection of the brother Frank had once known. His hair, once neatly cut, now curled slightly at the ends, a little too long, a little unkempt. The angles of his face were sharper, not sculpted by wealth, but by hardship. There was a hollowness in his eyes, a guarded weight pressing down on his posture. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Fred's fingers tightened on the edge of the door, knuckles whitening. His jaw worked as if he were trying to form words, but couldn't find the right ones. Frank didn't move. The air between them was thick, not with nostalgia, but with something far heavier. Years of silence, choices neither could take back, words that should have been said, but never were. Mary, oblivious to the storm brewing between them, grinned. "Dad, I found him." Fred blinked, his gaze flickering to his daughter. Then, slowly, his eyes returned to Frank, scanning his face like he was seeing a ghost. Frank, ever composed, nodded once. Fred. Fred didn't nod back. His expression hardened. Not anger, not exactly, but something close to it. "What are you doing here?" The words weren't welcoming. Mary, still cheerful, misread the tension. "He helped me when I fell," she said. "And he wanted to meet you." Fred's jaw ticked. He inhaled, slow and controlled. "Right." A pause. "I told him that we know him, so now you've met." Frank could have walked away then, maybe he should have, but instead, he did something he hadn't planned. "I'd like to come in." Fred's grip on the door tightened. For a second, it seemed like he might slam it shut. But then, something shifted. Maybe exhaustion, maybe resignation. Without a word, he stepped back. And Frank, for the first time in over a decade, stepped inside his brother's world. The apartment was small, dimly lit, and quiet except for the soft hum of a refrigerator and the distant chatter of a television left on in another room. It smelled lived in, coffee lingering in the air, faint traces of something fried earlier in the morning, and the unmistakable musk of old furniture. Frank stepped inside, careful, deliberate. The contrast to his own home was jarring. There were no marble floors, no towering ceilings, no walls lined with artwork that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Just scuffed wooden planks, a second-hand couch covered with a folded blanket, and a small kitchen tucked into the corner, its counters cluttered with stacked dishes. But the most telling detail was on the walls. Photographs. Frank's eyes drifted toward a cluster of framed pictures, slightly crooked, their edges worn from time. He saw a younger Fred traveling on a California beach. Beside that, a more recent image, Fred holding Mary as a baby, looking exhausted but undeniably proud. And further down, a school portrait of Mary, her wide grin revealing a missing tooth. Frank took it all in, the silent proof of a life he had known nothing about. Fred walked past him, wordlessly heading to the kitchen. He pulled open the refrigerator, grabbed a beer, and twisted off the cap with a sharp flick of his wrist. The bottle clinked against the counter as he set it down harder than necessary. "Do you still take yours black?" Fred's voice was rough, edged with something unreadable. Frank turned, caught off guard. "What?" Fred nodded toward the coffee maker, the one piece of kitchen equipment that looked used daily, almost religiously. For a moment, Frank could only stare. It was such a normal question, one a brother might ask if they had seen each other last week instead of a decade ago. "Yeah," Frank said finally. "Black." Fred said nothing, but after a few seconds, he moved. The hiss of hot coffee dripping into a chipped ceramic mug filled the space between them. Mary climbed onto a chair by the window, swinging her legs idly. Dad, I showed him my bike. Fred didn't look up as he poured. Is that right? Yeah, he said he runs races. Sounds about right. Mary hummed, satisfied with her small contribution to the conversation before turning her attention back to the world outside. Frank took the coffee Fred slid across the counter toward him. It was hot, bitter, stronger than what he was used to. You still live here, Frank said, after a long silence, setting the cup down. He hadn't meant for it to come out like an observation, but it did. Fred exhaled through his nose, leaning against the counter. Not all of us trade up when things go south. The jab landed, a sharp reminder of why they were here, standing in this cramped kitchen rather than anywhere else. Frank didn't take the bait. I thought you stayed in LA, Fred scoffed. Yeah? That's what you thought? He shook his head, taking a slow sip of his beer before muttering, Figures. The weight of something unspoken settled between them. Frank stared at his brother, taking in the lines on his face, the way his shoulders hunched slightly, like he carried a weight he couldn't put down. He'd always assumed Fred had found his own way, a different path, a different city, a different future. He had told himself that was why they had never spoken again, that it was distance, not avoidance, that Fred had moved on, built something new. But now, looking at the second-hand furniture, the cracked tiles in the kitchen, the exhausted way Fred carried himself, he realized how wrong he had been. Fred hadn't moved on. He had come back, and for all these years, he had been just miles away, broke, struggling, alone. Frank swallowed, forcing his voice steady. Why didn't you tell me? Fred's jaw clenched. He set his bottle down with a hollow thunk against the counter. You don't get to ask that, he said, voice tight. Not after 10 years. Frank exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. Fred dash. I walked away, Fred cut in, quiet, but the bitterness in his voice was unmistakable. After everything you just... He stopped, shaking his head, like the words weren't worth saying out loud. Frank stayed silent, because Fred was right. When Fred had thrown himself into that reckless investment, Frank had warned him, had tried to stop him. They had argued, shouted, cursed, slammed doors, and then, when it all fell apart, Fred had been too proud to ask for help, and Frank too angry to offer it. So, he hadn't. And now, they were standing here, two men separated by a decade of silence, both wondering if it was too late to fix it. Fred sighed, rubbing his temples before glancing at Mary. She had curled into the chair, head resting against her arms, eyelids fluttering as she teetered on the edge of sleep. Frank followed his gaze. A child, a daughter he hadn't known existed. He looked back at Fred. Your wife? The name alone was enough to darken Fred's expression. He didn't answer at first, just took another long drink. Susan. She left, he finally said. A while ago. Frank processed that. He could see the exhaustion in Fred's face, the way he'd hardened in the years since. You raised her alone? Fred gave a humorless chuckle. Guess I didn't have much of a choice. Frank's grip on his coffee cup tightened. He should have been here. He should have known. Instead, Fred had been left to deal with everything, alone, broke, raising a daughter with nothing but whatever stubborn pride he had left. The realization sat heavy in Frank's chest. Another silence. Then, without looking up, Fred spoke. Why are you here, Frank? The question lingered between them, and for the first time since stepping into this apartment, Frank wasn't sure of the answer. The silence sat thick between them, a weight neither was willing to lift. Frank's fingers curled around the ceramic mug, the heat of the coffee grounding him. Across the small kitchen, Fred stood rigid, arms crossed over his chest, his body angled just enough to keep distance between them. Mary stirred slightly in her chair, lifting her head, her sleepy eyes darting between the two men. She didn't understand the tension, not fully. To her, They were simply two adults who needed to stop being stubborn. "Dad," she murmured, rubbing at her eyes. "Can we get lunch?" Fred exhaled through his nose. "We have food here." "But I want a hamburger," she whined, stretching her small arms above her head before blinking at Frank. "Do you like hamburgers?" Frank found himself caught in her gaze. He hesitated. "I do." Mary beamed and turned back to Fred. "See? He likes hamburgers too." Fred sighed, shaking his head. "That's not a reason to—" Frank, watching the subtle slump in his brother's posture, made a decision before he could second-guess it. "Let's go," he said simply. Fred's head snapped up, his frown deepening. "Frank, my treat," Fred scoffed. "Oh, your treat? How generous of you." Mary, oblivious to the underlying tension, clapped her hands. "Yes!" She scrambled off the chair before Fred could argue further, already moving toward the door. Fred muttered a curse under his breath before rubbing a hand down his face. For a moment, Frank thought he would refuse again, but then he let out a tired sigh. Fine. Not an agreement. Not surrender, but a small step forward. The diner wasn't far. Frank let Mary lead the way, her small frame practically bouncing down the sidewalk. It was a neighborhood spot, not one of the high-end restaurants he was used to. Red leather booths, checkered floors, the faint scent of fried food lingering in the air. They slid into a booth, Mary between them, her feet kicking beneath the table. A waitress appeared, pen poised. Middle-aged, sharp eyes, the kind of woman who'd worked in places like this long enough to know when something wasn't just a normal family outing. "What can I get y'all?" "Hamburger," Mary said immediately. "With fries." The waitress nodded. "And for you two?" Fred barely looked at the menu. "Same." Frank hesitated, but then said, "Yeah, same." When she walked away, the quiet stretched between them again. Mary, unfazed, picked up a crayon from the small basket on the table and began doodling on the paper placemat, humming under her breath. Frank's gaze flickered to Fred. His brother was looking anywhere but at him, fingers tapping lightly against the table, a habit he had when he was holding something back. "Place hasn't changed much," Frank said, his voice even. Fred snorted. "Did you expect it to?" "No," Frank admitted. "Just remembering." Fred didn't say anything, but the tension in his shoulders shifted, just slightly. Frank glanced around. They had sat in a place just like this as kids, their mother fussing over Fred's messy hair, while Frank tried to ignore how their father always seemed one drink too deep into his day. "Mom used to love diners," Frank said. "She liked the pie." Fred exhaled a short laugh, barely there. "Yeah." A beat. "She always said, never trust a place that doesn't sell pie." Frank found himself grinning, a real one, not the practiced, polite kind he had perfected over the years. She did. For a brief second, it felt like they were just two brothers again. Then the food arrived, and the moment faded. Mary chatted happily as she ate, blissfully unaware of the slow, delicate shifts happening between her father and uncle. Fred ate slowly, methodically, as if he didn't quite trust the situation yet. Frank, on the other hand, found himself stealing small glances at his brother, watching the way he hunched slightly over his plate, the guarded way he held himself. Time had etched itself into Fred's features, the fine lines around his mouth, the tired set of his eyes, the way his knuckles bore faint scars from a life spent working with his hands instead of behind a desk. Frank wanted to say something, anything, but where did you even begin when a decade stood between you? He picked up a fry, chewing slowly. The flavors were familiar: grease, salt, and the same brand of ketchup they used as kids. He swallowed. "Still put too much salt on your fries?" Fred barely lifted his gaze. "Do you still eat too slowly?" Frank huffed a quiet chuckle. Fred took another bite of his burger, and for the first time that afternoon, he wasn't scowling. It wasn't much, but it was something. After the meal, they stepped outside, the autumn air crisp around them. Mary walked ahead, balancing on the edge of the curb like a tightrope walker. Fred shoved his hands into his pockets. His posture wasn't as tense anymore, but the wariness still lingered. Frank watched him, then said, "You know, you could have just told me." Fred scoffed, shaking his head, and said what? "Hey, I ruined my life, need a hand?" Frank's jaw tightened. "You were my brother before you were a failed investment." Fred stilled, his fingers flexed, curling into his palms. Mary called back to them, her voice bright. "Can we do this again?" Fred's throat bobbed. He didn't answer immediately. Then, so quiet that only Frank would catch it, he muttered, "We'll see." The crisp autumn air carried the scent of dry leaves and distant car exhaust as Frank and Fred stood outside the diner, their breath curling in the cold. Mary skipped ahead, her arms stretched out like a tightrope walker on the curb's edge, completely unaware of the silent weight still hanging between the two men. Frank turned slightly, hands slipping into the pockets of his coat. This was his moment, a fragile opening. He wasn't sure if it was the right time, or if it would ever be the right time. But the past decade had taught him one thing. Hesitation meant losing. "You should come over this weekend," he said, voice casual, measured. Fred's jaw tightened almost immediately. It was reflex, that automatic rejection forming before he even fully processed the words. Mary spun on her heels, eyes lighting up instantly. "Really?" Frank nodded. "Yeah, there's a pool and a movie room. You might like it." Mary gasped like he'd just told her she won the lottery. "A pool?" Fred inhaled slowly through his nose, shoulders stiffening. "Frank." "You don't have to," Frank cut in, reading the argument before it even left his brother's mouth. "But if you want, the door's open." He kept his voice even, his expression unreadable, but something about the way he said it, not a demand, not an expectation, just an offer, made Fred hesitate. Mary was practically vibrating with excitement now. "Dad, please, just for one day, please." Fred sighed, running a hand through his hair, the weight of years pressing into that single breath. He could say no. He probably should. But when he looked at Mary, her hopeful, eager face, it became impossible. "Fine." Mary cheered, throwing her arms up like she had won something. Frank let out a slow breath. A small victory. The mansion Frank's home sat at the edge of the city, a world away from the life Fred had built. Mary practically vibrated in the passenger seat as they pulled into the circular driveway, her nose pressed to the window. The house was a towering estate of glass and stone, its sleek lines and pristine gardens giving it the look of something out of a magazine. "Dad," she whispered, awestruck, "are we in a movie?" Fred didn't answer. He was too busy gripping the sleeves of his worn jacket, his fingers curled into the fabric like he was bracing for impact. He followed Mary out of the car, his boots making a dull sound against the polished stone. Everything here felt too big, too empty, too sterile. Inside, the ceilings stretched impossibly high. Polished marble floors gleamed under soft lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows opened to an expansive backyard where, sure enough, a pristine pool shimmered like glass. Fred's footsteps felt too heavy, too rough for a place like this. He didn't belong here. He knew it, and so did Frank. But then there was Mary, spinning in circles in the foyer, fingers trailing along sleek countertops, eyes wide with unfiltered amazement. She belonged everywhere. Frank let her explore, letting her excitement fill the spaces that had felt too quiet for too long. Fred, on the other hand, kept his arms crossed, his back stiff, his expression unreadable. Frank finally spoke. "You want a drink?" Fred scoffed, glancing at the pristine kitchen. "What, you got beer flown in from some private vineyard?" Frank smirked, number just regular beer. Fred rolled his eyes but followed him anyway. It was something. A slow thaw. The afternoon passed in quiet moments, neither rushed nor forced. Mary darted between the pool and the kitchen, swapping her sneakers for bare feet, her laughter filling the halls. Fred and Frank moved in small, careful steps around each other, like two men relearning a language they hadn't spoken in years. They cooked together, sort of. Frank had planned a meal, but Fred took over halfway through, grumbling about how Frank still couldn't chop an onion properly. "You still hold the knife like a damn pencil," Fred muttered, swiping it out of his hand and demonstrating. Frank watched, a small smirk forming. "You sound like Mom." Fred froze for half a second before shaking his head. "She was a better cook." Frank chuckled. "No argument there." A small thaw, not much, but enough. Mary was in the pool before the plates were cleared, her small frame darting through the water like a fish. Fred sat stiffly at the edge, his boots planted on the stone, arms still crossed over his chest. Frank watched him for a while before finally saying, "It's just water, you know." Fred huffed. "Easy for you to say, when you're not the one drying a kid's hair for an hour after." Frank leaned back in his chair. "She's happy." Fred sighed, rubbing his face. "Yeah." A pause. "She deserves to be." Something in Frank's chest tightened. "She's a good kid." Fred nodded once. "She is." Silence settled again, but this time it wasn't quite as heavy. It wasn't comfortable, not yet, but it was getting there. And when Mary called out to them, waving from the water, both men looked up at the same time. Fred stood first, stretching. "Come on, kid. 10 more minutes, then we head out." Mary groaned, but grinned. "Fine." Frank, watching them, didn't say anything, but as Fred helped Mary out of the pool, tucking a towel around her shoulders, Frank realized something. For the first time in years, this house didn't feel quite so empty. The drive back was quiet. Mary, exhausted from her day at the mansion, had fallen asleep in the back seat, her small head resting against the window. Fred kept his eyes on the road, but his grip on the steering wheel was tight, knuckles pale beneath the dim glow of the dashboard. Frank sat in the passenger seat, watching his brother carefully. The visit had been a temporary truce, a few hours of pretending things weren't as broken as they actually were. But now, in the dark hush of the car, reality settled back in. Fred finally spoke, breaking the silence. "You didn't need to do all that." Frank turned toward him. "Do what?" Fred scoffed, shaking his head. "Mary doesn't need to think we're something we're not." Frank exhaled, keeping his voice even. "And what exactly are we, Fred?" Fred didn't answer, but Frank had seen it, that flicker of something when Fred had watched Mary run her hands over polished countertops, the hesitation in his step as he stood in the warmth of a house that wasn't his. "Come on," Frank said after a moment. "Let's get a drink." Fred shot him a sideways glance. "It's late." "Exactly." Fred sighed through his nose but didn't argue. He pulled the car into a parking lot just off the main road, where an old neon sign flickered above a small, run-down bar. Inside, the place was nearly empty. A bartender wiping down the counter, an old man nursing a whiskey, a couple lost in quiet conversation. Fred ordered a beer. Frank did the same. They sat in a booth near the back, the old leather seats cracked from years of wear. Frank took a sip of his drink before speaking. "What happened to that recreation center on Oak Street?" Fred glanced at him, caught off guard. "What?" "The community center," Frank repeated. "It used to have that after-school program, basketball, tutoring. I remember Mom bringing us there." Fred let out a small, humorless chuckle. "That place is still standing, barely. Roof leaks when it rains, half the lights don't work, and the heating's shot." He shook his head. "But it's the only place kids like Mary have when school's out." Frank frowned. "There's nowhere else." Fred scoffed. "This isn't your side of town, Frank. The city's got other priorities. The funding dried up years ago." Frank sat back, fingers tapping lightly against his glass. The thought of kids with nowhere to go, Sitting in a freezing building with leaking ceilings and flickering lights didn't sit right with him. But he knew Fred. He knew if he pulled out his checkbook, if he offered to throw money at the problem, Fred would push back. Hard. So instead, Frank leaned forward, keeping his voice casual. "We should fix it." Fred paused, his beer halfway to his lips. "What?" "The center," Frank said. "We should fix it." Fred stared at him like he wasn't sure if he was hearing correctly. "We?" Frank nodded. "You and me." Fred set his beer down. "No offense, but I don't see you crawling under pipes and patching up roofs." Frank smirked. "I'd like to see you try to stop me." Fred studied him, his expression unreadable. "Why do you care?" Frank's grip on his glass tightened slightly. "Because I should have been here sooner." Fred's jaw tightened. "That doesn't mean you can—" "I'm not trying to fix the past, Fred." Frank held his gaze. "I'm just saying, maybe we can do something right now." Fred didn't look away, didn't immediately shoot him down. He just sat there, thinking. And then, for the first time in years, he nodded. Breaking ground. The first morning at the community center, Frank regretted everything. The place was a wreck. Ceiling tiles sagged, the smell of mildew clung to the walls, and the old basketball court had so many cracks it looked like a jigsaw puzzle. The heating barely worked, and the back rooms, once meant for tutoring, had peeling paint and broken furniture. Fred was already inside, rolling up his sleeves like he'd been doing this for years. "Welcome to paradise," he muttered, handing Frank a toolbox. Frank glanced at the rusted screws and worn-out hammer. "Great." Mary ran in behind them, bright-eyed. "Can I help?" Fred turned. "Kid, you can't even hold a wrench." Mary put her hands on her hips. "Can too." Frank smirked. "She's got your attitude." Fred sighed. "Yeah, I noticed." They got to work. The first day was grueling. Frank, unaccustomed to manual labor, quickly learned the difference between a business deal and real physical work. By midday, his hands ached from prying up old floorboards. Sweat clung to the back of his neck, and his once clean shirt was covered in dust. Fred worked beside him, silent but steady, moving with the ease of a man who had spent years fixing things with his hands. At some point, Mary brought them sandwiches. They ate on overturned paint buckets, surrounded by half-demolished walls. "You look tired," Mary told Frank, taking a big bite of her sandwich. Fred smirked. First time he's done an honest day's work. Frank wiped a hand down his face. This was a terrible idea. Fred chuckled, shaking his head. But then, as he glanced around at the center, the place he had spent years trying to keep afloat, his expression softened. And Frank saw it. The first glimpse of something like gratitude. Not spoken, not admitted, but there. They finished eating in comfortable silence, the sounds of hammers and drills echoing through the old building. For the first time in years, they were building something together. Leave a comment candy if you find the brotherly love between the two of them interesting and admirable. The community center had become a sanctuary, a place where the city's forgotten could find warmth, food, and, if only for a little while, some measure of peace. After weeks of work, it was finally up and running. The leaks had been patched, the heating repaired, and the walls repainted. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best it had been in years. Fred had always been the one who kept things running, but now, with Frank's help, it actually felt sustainable. The once skeptical volunteers now greeted Frank with nods instead of wary glances. The kids recognized him. Even the regulars, mothers balancing jobs and childcare, exhausted fathers trying to keep their families together, had grown used to seeing him around. But it only took one bad night to remind them of how fragile everything still was. It was an evening. Most of the families had already left. Only a few stragglers remained. Parents gathering belongings, volunteers stacking chairs, Fred double-checking the pantry supplies. Frank was in the office, going over the monthly expense sheet, when the commotion started. A voice, loud and slurred, broke through the quiet. "You think you can hide from me?" Frank's head snapped up. The tone sent a cold prickle down his spine. He was already moving before he fully understood what was happening. Out in the main hall, a man stood near the entrance, swaying slightly. His face red from alcohol, his clothes wrinkled and stained. His eyes were wild, darting around the room before settling on a woman and a small boy cowering behind Fred. The woman, Marie, a regular at the center, held her son tightly, her entire body trembling. "Go home, Alex," Fred said, voice firm but calm. The man, Alex, ignored him. "She's my wife," he slurred, "and that's my son." Marie shrank back, pressing herself closer to Fred, her grip on her child tightening. Frank stepped forward. "Sir, you need to leave." Alex's bloodshot eyes flickered to him. "And who the hell are you?" Frank kept his tone even. "Someone who's telling you to walk away." Alex laughed, but there was no humor in it, just something unhinged. "You don't get to tell me what to do." Fred moved slightly, positioning himself between Alex and Marie. "You're drunk," he said, voice low, careful. "Go sleep it off." Alex's expression twisted. "You don't get to tell me how to handle my family," he snarled, his hands clenched into fists, dangerous, unpredictable. Frank recognized the look in his eyes. He'd seen it before, in boardrooms, in backroom deals, in men who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose. Then Alex's hand darted to the side, grabbing an empty beer bottle from a nearby table. For a split second, everything slowed. Frank knew what was about to happen. He could see it in the way Alex gritted his teeth, the way his arm tensed, the way his fingers curled around the neck of the bottle. Then, glass shattered. Frank had moved before he could think, stepping forward just as Alex swung the broken bottle toward him, jagged edges flashing under the fluorescent lights. But Fred moved faster. He shoved Frank aside, and the glass sliced across his forearm instead. Fred gritted his teeth, staggering back, blood already soaking through his sleeve. And then, chaos. Volunteers and staff rushed forward, some tackling Alex to the ground, while others scrambled to get help. The sound of a child crying, a woman screaming, and chairs crashing into the floor filled the air. Frank caught Fred as he nearly stumbled, his hand pressing against the wound. "You idiot," Frank muttered, his voice unsteady. Fred let out a breathless chuckle. "You're welcome." The waiting room was silent, except for the occasional beep of machines and the muffled voices of nurses down the hall. Frank sat in the stiff plastic chair next to Fred's hospital bed, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. Fred, his arm now wrapped in clean white bandages, glanced at him. "You're hovering." Frank didn't answer. Fred sighed. "I'm fine, Frank. You lost a lot of blood." Fred smirked, wincing slightly as he adjusted himself against the pillows. "Didn't have much to spare anyway." Frank shook his head. "Not funny." Fred huffed a small laugh. "A little funny." Frank let out a slow breath, running a hand through his hair. His usual composure had cracked, just a little, something Fred rarely got to see. "You always did have a bad habit of jumping into fights that weren't yours," Frank muttered. Fred smirked. "You mean like that time in high school? The kid who called you a spoiled rich boy?" Frank rolled his eyes. "You broke his nose." Fred raised an eyebrow. "And you told Mom I fell off my bike." Frank's lips twitched. "You're welcome." They sat there, in the sterile glow of the hospital room, a decade of silence chipping away piece by piece. Then, after a moment, Frank's voice softened. "You didn't have to do that, you know." Fred shrugged, wincing again at the movement. "Yeah, I did." Frank swallowed, something unreadable flashing in his eyes. Guilt, gratitude, something in between. Fred saw it, but he didn't press. Instead, he just muttered, "Bet you'll actually put in some real work at the center now, huh?" Frank smirked. Don't push it. Fred chuckled, closing his eyes briefly. He was exhausted, but for the first time in years, he didn't feel so alone. And as Frank sat beside him, arms still crossed, still trying to keep the world at a safe distance, Fred knew that, for once, Frank wasn't going anywhere. The cold had settled in early that year, painting the city in muted greys and browns. The leaves that once clung stubbornly to the trees had given up their fight, now scattered across sidewalks and streets, damp from the last night's rain. Inside the community center, the heating hummed steadily, a welcome contrast to the biting chill outside. It had become a second home now, not just for those who needed it, but for those who had built it. Fred was at the back, sleeves rolled up, fixing a leaking faucet in the kitchen. The place still had its issues, but it stood stronger than before, filled with life in a way it hadn't been in years. Mary was at one of the tables, coloring with a few other kids, her laughter bright and unburdened. And Frank, who 3 months ago wouldn't have been caught dead in a place like this, was in the office, buried in paperwork, muttering to himself about funding applications. It was, by all accounts, a normal day. Until he watched as a sleek black car pulled into the parking lot, Fred felt something tense in his chest. He had a strange sense, and when the back door opened and a tall woman stepped out, his stomach twisted. Susan. She hadn't changed much, still polished, still beautiful in that effortless way she always had been, her hair swept back in a way that probably took an expensive stylist an hour to perfect. But it wasn't just her. A man stepped out beside her, tall, graying at the temples, in a tailored suit that probably cost more than a year's worth of rent in this neighborhood. Susan's new husband. Fred looked up. The wrench in his hand stilled, mid-turn. His face didn't change. No shock, no anger, just a stillness that spoke louder than any outburst ever could. For a moment, the entire center seemed to hold its breath. Not yet. Susan's gaze swept the building, and for a second, Fred thought he saw something shift in her expression. Regret. Number, probably just discomfort. She looked at Fred, and there it was, the weight of everything left unsaid between them. Then, before he could say a word, Mary came bounding out of the front doors. "Dad!" she called, then skidded to a stop when she saw Susan. Fred felt his stomach drop. Mary didn't know. She had no memory of Susan. She had been too young when her mother walked away. To Mary, Susan was just a stranger in expensive heels. But Susan knew. Fred watched as his ex-wife's face cracked for just a moment when she looked at their daughter. Mary, completely unaware of the storm brewing in the air, smiled. "Hi." Susan swallowed, then, so quietly that Fred barely caught it, said, "Hi, sweetheart." Just then, Sean, Mary's best friend at the center, waved to her. "Mary, I found some stray cats and dogs left here." Mary quickly let go of Fred's hand. Those poor animals were more important than a rich stranger right now. Fred and Susan were alone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Fred exhaled sharply. "What are you doing here, Susan?" Susan's shoulders squared, that old defensive posture creeping back in. "We're here to donate." Fred let out a humorless chuckle. "Oh, you're a philanthropist now?" Susan flinched, just barely. "It's not like that." Fred folded his arms, leaning against the wall. "Then what's it like?" Susan hesitated, then glanced at the building behind him. "I heard about what you've done here. I wanted to see it myself." Fred scoffed. "No, you wanted to see if I was still drowning." Susan didn't deny it. Instead, she said, "I didn't think you'd make it, you know." Fred felt a flicker of something. Old anger, old wounds. "Yeah, well, neither did I." A silence stretched between them, heavy and full of memories neither of them wanted to unpack. Then Susan's voice softened. "She's beautiful." Fred's jaw tightened. "She's strong." Susan swallowed, her hands curling at her sides. "Does she—" She hesitated. "Does she ask about me?" Fred's voice was even. She doesn't know you exist. The words landed like a punch, and for the first time, Susan looked truly wounded. Fred could almost hear it. The things she wanted to say but couldn't. The excuses, the guilt, but he wasn't here for that. I'm not angry anymore, Fred admitted. Not the way I used to be. Susan blinked. But I'm not going to forgive you either. She flinched. Fred shook his head. You made your choice. I made mine. And she's better off without you. Susan's breath hitched, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her purse, pulled out a folded check, and held it out to him. Fred glanced at it. A large sum, enough to fund the center for months. He exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. Is this for us or for you? Susan's eyes shone with something close to shame. Does it matter? She whispered. Fred hesitated. Then slowly, he took the check. Not for her. Not for him. For the people who needed it. Susan nodded once, as if she understood. And then, before Fred could say anything else, she turned. Her husband was already waiting at the car. But just before she left, Susan stopped. She turned, hesitated, and then, for the first and last time, she walked over to where Mary was petting the cats. Susan knelt in front of Mary. Mary blinked at her, confused. Susan's hands trembled as she reached out, not to take, not to hold, but simply to touch the edge of Mary's sleeve. She didn't speak, didn't say her name, just held that moment. Then, just as quickly, she rose, eyes glistening, and walked out the door. The night had settled deep by the time Frank arrived at the community center. The city streets were quiet, the occasional flicker of a passing car's headlights casting fleeting shadows against the worn brick walls. It had been a long day, longer than he would have liked, but he was here now, his tie loosened, exhaustion weighing on his shoulders. Inside, the center was quiet, but alive in its own way. The last of the volunteers were stacking chairs, murmuring goodnights to each other. A few families lingered, kids curled up in the reading corner with donated books, their parents chatting in hushed tones. The place felt lived in, warm. Frank had grown used to it. He hadn't expected that. As he stepped further inside, he found Fred at his usual spot, leaning against the kitchen counter, beer in hand, staring off into nothing. Something was off. Fred was still, too still. Frank frowned. You look like hell. Fred huffed a dry laugh, shaking his head. You say that like it's new. Frank moved toward the counter, leaning against it. What happened? Fred didn't answer right away. He took a slow sip of his drink, his fingers tapping absently against the bottle. Then, without looking up, he muttered, Susan was here. Frank stilled. It took him a second to process, the words landing heavier than he expected. Here, he repeated. Fred nodded once. With her husband, came to donate. Frank scoffed, crossing his arms. That's ironic. Fred chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Yeah. Silence stretched between them. Frank waited for the anger, the resentment, for Fred to snap like he used to. But instead, Fred just let out a long breath and said, I told her I wasn't angry anymore. That surprised Frank. He studied his brother carefully. Fred's posture was different tonight. Not rigid with bitterness, not weighed down by old wounds. Just tired, but lighter. And? Frank prompted. Fred let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. And I meant it. Frank exhaled, nodding slightly. That's new. Fred shot him a look, but didn't argue. They stood there for a moment, the humming of the old refrigerator filling the silence. Then Fred straightened, pushing off the counter. Come on. Frank raised an eyebrow. Where? Fred grabbed another beer, tossing it to him. Your place. Frank caught the bottle, skeptical. My place. Fred smirked, already heading for the door. What? You're always telling me I should visit. Frank blinked, then shook his head, amused despite himself. The mansion balcony. By the time they got to Frank's mansion, the city was a sea of quiet lights. Fred stood on the balcony, leaning against the railing, beer in one hand, the other stuffed into his pocket. The cold air didn't seem to bother him. Frank joined him, standing a few feet away. Below, the gardens stretched out in perfect symmetry, the pool's water still and untouched. Fred let out a low whistle. "Still ridiculous," Frank smirked. "You get used to it." Fred took a sip of his beer, his gaze drifting. "Mary thought your house was magic, you know." Frank chuckled. "She said that?" Fred nodded. "After we left, she asked me if you were a king or something." Frank smirked. "And what did you say?" "I told her no, you're just a guy with too much money and not enough sense." Frank huffed a laugh, shaking his head. "Sounds about right." For a moment, they just stood there, watching the city. Then Fred exhaled, rubbing his jaw. "I don't feel like a failure anymore." Frank turned slightly, surprised. Fred's voice was even and steady. "For years I did. Thought I'd messed up too bad, lost too much. But this place, the center, Mary, even you showing up like a damn stray cat." He let out a breathy chuckle. "I built something. We built something." Frank swallowed, something thick settling in his chest. Fred glanced at him. "Not bad for two idiots who used to fight over who got the last slice of pizza." Frank smirked. "You always stole it." Fred grinned. "Because I was faster." Frank shook his head, looking back over the city. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like they were looking back anymore. They were here, moving forward, letting go, together. The community center had become more than just a building. It had become a home, not just for the people who relied on it, but for the ones who built it. It was a year. Fred had settled into his role effortlessly, slipping into leadership as though he had always belonged there. Volunteers and families looked to him for guidance, not just because he ran the place, but because he understood them. He knew what it meant to struggle, to fight for something, to lose everything and start over. And Frank, who once lived in a world so far removed from this place, found himself coming back, more and more often. Some nights, he stayed late, looking over finances, making sure every dollar of funding went where it was needed. Other nights, he just watched, taking in the life around him, the warmth, the chatter, the quiet sense of purpose that filled the air. It was on one of those nights that Diana found him. She's a journalist who often comes here to volunteer and write articles introducing the center. Frank was sitting outside on the small back patio of the center, nursing a cup of coffee long gone cold. The sounds of laughter and conversation had started to die down inside, leaving only the hum of the city beyond the fences. Diana stepped out, pulling her coat tighter against the chill. "You look like someone who's thinking too much," she mused, leaning against the railing. Frank smirked, but didn't deny it. She studied him for a moment, her sharp, knowing gaze taking him apart piece by piece. "You've changed." Frank glanced at her. "Yeah?" She nodded. "The man I met months ago wouldn't have sat out here in the cold, drinking terrible coffee, thinking about something other than himself." Frank chuckled. "I didn't think it was that obvious." Diana shrugged, a small smile playing on her lips. "It is. But it's a good thing." Frank looked down at his cup, fingers wrapping around it like an anchor. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt at peace. And when Diana sat beside him, when her arm brushed lightly against his, he didn't move away. The years passed like changing seasons, subtle at first, then all at once. The community center, once a place of broken walls and shattered hope, thrived. It became more than just a shelter, more than just a project. It became home. Mary grew up within those walls, among the volunteers, the families who sought refuge, and the people who worked tirelessly to keep the center alive. She was tenacious, like her father, smart, full of hope, like the center had given her. And it was there, among the laughter of children and the smell of fresh paint on the walls, that she met Michael. He had been a new teacher in town, volunteering after school to help the kids with their studies. Gentle, patient, and kind in the way that people who've known hardship often are. Fred had watched them carefully, arms crossed, eyes narrowed, as Michael helped Mary with her college applications. He knew that look in his daughter's eyes. And when the time came, when Michael sat across from him one evening, fidgeting with his napkin, nervous as hell, Fred had simply smirked and said, "You're a good kid. Don't screw it up." A year later, Mary walked down the aisle in a small, beautiful ceremony held in the very place where she had spent her childhood. The community center. The place that had saved them. Frank had spent years avoiding attachments, throwing himself into work, building walls around his life, as if money and success could fill the spaces where family should have been. But Diana saw through him. She had known the center since before he and Fred had stepped in to rebuild it. Sharp, passionate, and fearless in a way that made her impossible to ignore. Frank had fought it at first, the pull, the way she challenged him, the way she looked at him like he was more than just the rich man funding a project. One night, after a particularly long board meeting at the center, she had thrown her hands up in frustration. "You're impossible," Frank had smirked, "and yet you keep showing up." Diana had stared at him for a long moment, then sighed. "Yeah, I do." And that had been the beginning. They took their time. For once in his life, Frank let things happen naturally, and when he finally admitted, to himself, to her, to Fred, that he had found something worth holding on to, Fred had just smirked over his beer and muttered, "Took you long enough." Fred never saw himself as a leader, but somewhere between the late nights, fixing the center's broken pipes, and the moments where people started turning to him for advice, he realized something. He mattered here, not just as a man who had made mistakes, not as someone who had lost, but as someone who had built something worth keeping. Frank had pushed for an official leadership role, something on paper, something permanent. Fred had resisted, until one day he didn't, until he stood at a podium, looking out at the community he had fought for, and realized that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The brothers, stronger than ever. One evening, long after the day's work was done, Fred and Frank sat on the same balcony they had stood on years before. The city stretched out before them, but for once, neither of them was looking at the past or the future. They were just here. Fred took a sip of his beer, leaning back in his chair. "I was thinking," Frank smirked. "Dangerous." Fred rolled his eyes. "Shut up. I was thinking about how we got here." Frank exhaled. "A hell of a road." Fred nodded. "Yeah, but it was worth it." Frank glanced at him. Fred never used to say things like that. And yet here he was, at peace. Frank let out a slow breath. Yeah, it was. For the first time in a long, long time, there was nothing left to fix, nothing left to regret. Just two brothers, side by side, knowing they had finally made it home. The afternoon sun cast long golden rays over the garden, warming the stone path where Frank sat, his old hands resting lightly on the arms of his chair. The once pristine mansion, which had felt so hollow all those years ago, now breathed with life. Laughter spilled from inside, his grandchildren running through the halls, their parents playfully scolding them. The place had transformed, no longer just a display of wealth, but a home filled with family. At 65, Frank felt every year in his bones, but not in a way that burdened him. Rather, it grounded him, reminded him of the road he had walked, of the things he had fought for, not in boardrooms, not in financial deals, but in something far greater. A legacy, a life worth remembering. "Grandpa," a small voice piped up beside him. Frank glanced down and found Daniel, his 7-year-old grandson, staring up at him with wide, curious eyes. Daniel had his mother's stubborn set of the jaw, but Diana's quiet wisdom. He was sharp, too sharp for his own good sometimes. "Mom says Uncle Fred once saved your life," Daniel said, swinging his legs over the edge of the bench. "Is it true?" Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "That's what she told you?" Daniel nodded eagerly. "Yep, she said Uncle Fred was like—" He paused, scrunching his face in thought. A superhero, but without a cape. Frank let out a laugh, deep and rich. He could already hear Fred's smug response if he ever heard that. "Well," Frank mused, leaning back, "it's true. He did save me. But if you tell him I admitted that, he'll never let me live it down." Daniel grinned, leaning in closer. "Tell me the story." Frank exhaled, staring out at the garden for a moment, before nodding. "All right, kid. But you've got to promise not to tell Uncle Fred that I said anything nice about him." Daniel giggled. "Promise." The story that changed everything. Frank told it slowly, letting the words settle in the warm air. The way the community center had been just starting to stand on its own feet, how Fred had taken charge of it, how he had become something more than just the man picking up the pieces of his past. And then, that night, the moment a drunken, angry man stormed in, demanding his family leave with him, the way Fred had stepped in, shielding a terrified mother and her son, how Frank had tried to de-escalate it, thinking he could control the situation the way he had controlled so many boardroom deals. But reality was not a negotiation, and when that bottle shattered, when Alex had swung at Frank with nothing but rage and desperation, Fred had moved without hesitation. "He stepped in," Frank said softly, the memory still sharp after all these years. "Didn't even think twice. He just acted." Daniel's eyes were wide. "And he got hurt?" Frank nodded. "Yeah. Got himself a nice scar to show for it, too." Daniel sat with that for a moment, small hands gripping his knees. "So Uncle Fred's really a hero?" Frank smirked. He'd never say it. But yeah, he is. Daniel beamed, as if he had just uncovered a great family secret. A moment of understanding. Across the yard, Fred sat with a book in his lap, but his eyes weren't on the pages. He was watching. He always was. Even after all these years, even with a lifetime of growth between them, Fred still had that instinct to watch over, to make sure everything was as it should be. Their eyes met. Fred raised a brow, smirking, as if he knew exactly what Frank had just been talking about. Frank shook his head, chuckling. Fred nodded once, a silent understanding passing between them. Neither of them had been perfect. Neither of them had done it alone. But they had made it, and that was enough. A life well lived. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the sky painted in soft hues of orange and pink, Frank closed his eyes for just a moment. The mansion was no longer empty. It was alive with love, with family, with laughter, with everything that truly mattered. For years, Frank had measured his success in dollars, in property, in deals won and lost. But this was wealth. This was what it meant to be rich, not in money, but in love, in family, in a life that, at long last, felt whole. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.